Happening Chiefs Kingdom, Gary McKenzie back at you again for another episode of Gridiron Lines. And if you're looking at your screen, you might see all these numbers, all this data, all this junk. Well, I'm showing you this because I finally finished compiling the wide receiver data from the last 10 years, having both their college production and then the productivity of their first 3 years. So for every wide receiver taken in the draft in the last 10 years, I've compiled data for their college statistics and in their first 3 years in the NFL. And the master plan is to use this data to try to predict how some of the Chiefs' younger wide receivers are going to play in 2023. Can they pan out? In this video, I'm not going to make the predictions, but what I am going to do is I'm going to review some of the information from this data and go over a lot of the wide receivers on the Chiefs roster and explain to you why I think that this is one of the most intriguing wide receiver groups the Chiefs have had from top to bottom in a long time. So if you can see here, this took me forever to get this data, and it's because there's just so much of it. I mean, we can just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And for every one of these data fields, I had to go and look up the player information and input this by hand. So you can see why it took me such a long time. I mean, we're still going, finally get to 21, 22, 23. But I don't have web scraper skills. I wish I did. Otherwise, I might have been able to do this with a web scraper. But brute force pretty much took care of it, I think, just as quickly as it would have for me to learn a web scraper and then parse all the data down. So yeah, we've got data now. We're going to have a couple of videos going over what this data are, going over things we can pull from this data. So there's a few interesting things in this video that I want to cover. Like I said, we're going to save the predictions for later, but let's go ahead and get started. And I actually have a slideshow today. So we're going to go back to old school, and I want to talk about my trip to Houston. So a couple weeks ago, I told you all that I was going to Houston, and highly recommend going to that city if you have a chance. It's a very neat city. I've been all over the United States, and I have to say Houston was one of my favorite places that I've visited as far as, the city goes. We went to the Space Center, NASA, and we took a tram tour for the mission control. And during that tour, they stopped you in, I think it was building 39, if I remember correctly. And this is essentially the building where mission control was for the first moon landing. And they had redone the room entirely such that it was exactly like it was on the day whenever the first moon landing occurred. They then put a television broadcast in the room. It was like a small theater. And we watched how the electronics, the computers, how they functioned during the moon landing while it was being live streamed. So basically it put you back in that state of time and simulated all the exact data, all the exact numbers that were shown on the screen. All the computers were up and running with the lights on. I mean, it was unbelievable. And the little theater that we were in, that was actually used during the moon landing for family members of, the people that worked for NASA, the family members of the astronauts. The Queen was in there, politicians were in there. And so it was amazing. I mean, if you have a chance to go to Houston, I cannot recommend going to the Space Center enough. And then make sure you pay a little extra to go on a tram tour for mission control because it is well worth the money. I mean, this was amazing. And then nextly, my son and I got to see the Chili Peppers at Minute Maid Park. I'd never been to Minute Maid Park before. It's a pretty neat little baseball stadium. Good venue for a concert. We had a blast. And love or hate the Chili Peppers, that's fine by me. I can understand why people don't like them, but they're one of my favorite bands. I just love Flea's funky bass guitar, and I like John Frusciante as well, and then Chad Smith on the drums. And then Kiedis has many shortcomings, but he at least has good flow. So Red Hot Chili Peppers, one of my favorite bands. Got to see him for the third time. That was my son's first concert. Music's a big thing in our family. And so I'm really glad that he has taken an interest in it. And, a lot of good things can come from learning to play an instrument and just having a musical interest in general. So I'm truly blessed to have a son who's really a chip off the old block. And we had a great time. I mean, that was his first concert, and I just wish I could express how much fun he had, because he had the time of his life. And going on, we'll get back to the Chiefs stuff, but Houston's a cool city, like I said. And so I'm going to ask a question here. And the question I'm going to ask is, do NFL GMs care about college production when drafting wide receivers? And so the question is pretty simple. Is there a relationship between production and when a player was drafted? So the more production that a player has, are they more likely to be drafted earlier on in the earlier rounds? And so I did a correlation coefficient mainly because I wanted to see the trend line. And yes, that's true. So NFL GMs do care about production because you can see this clear trend line that goes down. So the later in the draft, or the later in the draft, the later round in the draft, the less production, or the less average production a wide receiver has. So NFL GMs do care about production, and that's pretty intuitive. I mean, that makes sense. Of course they do. But I want to talk about the Chiefs GMs and splitting it into, John Dorsey and Brett Veach. But have John Dorsey and Brett Veach cared about wide receiver production in the past 10 years? And looking at their averages over time, you can see the same downward trend. So both John Dorsey and Brett Veach have cared about production whenever you combine both of their picks. But if you break them up, you're going to see something pretty interesting here. And production-wise, this is question number 3. Production-wise, how do the Chiefs compare to the rest of the NFL when drafting wide receivers in terms of productivity? And so we're going to start with good old John Dorsey. And this, I probably could have picked a better picture for John Dorsey, but we're going to go with this one. And so, as you know, John Dorsey was the GM for the Chiefs whenever Andy Reid first came to Kansas City, made it until 2018. Brett Veach took over in 2018, 2019. Brett Veach's first draft was in 2019. And so John Dorsey's drafting of wide receivers was interesting. So he didn't take a single round 1 wide receiver, didn't take a single round 2 wide receiver, took only 1 third-round wide receiver, and that was Chris Conley. And in college, Chris Conley averaged 39.6 yards per game receiving. During that same time frame, the NFL average for third-round picks over the last 10 years is 62.6 receiving yards per game. So 23 yards less per game average was Chris Conley than his peers taken in the third round. Moving on to round 4, he took 2 wide receivers, D-Rob and Jehu Chesson. They averaged 43.3 yards per game receiving. The NFL average in round 4 was 59.8 receiving yards per game. So both of these guys combined 16 yards less. Next, you have round 5, and I'm not going to knock this pick, was Tyreek Hill. He averaged 23.4 yards per game, the only 5th-round wide receiver John Dorsey drafted. Whereas the NFL average at that position in the round 5, they averaged 56.2 receiving yards per game. So Tyreek Hill was about 33 yards less than that average. Now, obviously, we all know what happened to Tyreek Hill. But regarding John Dorsey, there's this very clear pattern with him when he was drafting wide receivers, and that was he didn't care about college production. He trusted his eyes. He trusted what the tape was showing him and didn't really care how productive the player was in college. He thought that whenever they got to Kansas City, he could coach them up, or the Chiefs coaching staff could coach them up and get more production out of them. And that wasn't the case. So other than Tyreek Hill, the Chiefs didn't have a single standout wide receiver. Yes, D-Rob and Chris Conley had their moments, but they were never, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 quality players. And there's a lot of talk, over the years about Tyreek Hill and how it was actually Brett Veach who pounded the table for Tyreek Hill. So John Dorsey's drafting of wide receivers was not very good other than Tyreek Hill. And I think that, one of the reasons for that is because he just didn't care about college production enough. I'm from the school of thought that if you produce in college, you have a chance of producing in the NFL. If you don't produce in college, you have a much more difficult chance of producing in the NFL, because if you can't produce in college, the NFL is another step up. There better be a pretty dang good reason for why you didn't produce in college if you didn't. And this all goes back to my algorithm that I wrote for grad school that would try to predict players to take in the NFL draft. And for the wide receiver position, they really cared about both production and athleticism. You have to have both. And John Dorsey wasn't doing that. He was just focusing on the physical metrics, the tape that he liked, and didn't care about the production. And I do not believe that was a winning strategy, because the algorithm that I wrote was very successful. It was more productive and more successful at picking wide receivers than NFL GMs were. And so I think that Dorsey had a fatal flaw to his wide receiver selection in that he didn't care about production enough. But moving on to Brett Veach, this is where things start to change for the Chiefs. And I think that their fortunes are going to change in terms of how productive their wide receivers are that they draft. And so in rounds 1, 3, 4, 6, and 7, Veach hasn't drafted a single wide receiver. So I had this 72.7 receiving yards per game as the NFL average. That's the average for round 1. We already saw all the averages for each round with John Dorsey. So if you want to go over those again or see those again, just rewind a little bit through the video. Round 2, Brett Veach has drafted 2 wide receivers, Skyy Moore and Rashee Rice. They have averaged 78.4 yards per game in college. The NFL average during the last 10 years of second-round wide receivers is 66 receiving yards per game. So Brett Veach is going on the opposite spectrum of John Dorsey here in drafting players who are overproductive in college, over the average, by 12.4 yards per game. And this is what I'm talking about. I like the fact that both Skyy Moore and Rashee Rice have production in college, and they also have athleticism. And I really like Rashee Rice because he has size, he has strength, and he has athleticism, and he had production in college. He basically has the trifecta of things you want to see from a wide receiver standpoint coming out of college. So I am very interested in seeing how Rashee Rice pans out, and I think he's going to have a good career. I think he's going to have a good year next year too. Lastly, round 5, 1 wide receiver taken. He took Cornell Powell, and he took Cornell Powell, and I think it was 2021. Don't quote me that. I could be wrong though. And he averaged 31.1 yards per game. The NFL average was 62.6 receiving yards per game. And so well below the average. So this is kind of another pick where maybe they like this tape. And I'm forgetting one player, and that is Mecole Hardman. So Mecole Hardman would drop this 78.4 value down because he was pretty unproductive in college. So let's see if we can find him here. Okay, there's Mecole Hardman. So Mecole Hardman was drafted by Brett Veach in 2019. Only averaged 33.14 yards per game. And so comparing that against the average, he was a good 45, 43, 44 yards below the average. And so that would drop, Veach's overall number from that 78.4 to much lower or fairly lower. But this is why I think that there is kind of a change in the Chiefs front office around 2021, 2022. where they said, hey, these low production wide receivers aren't getting it done for us. We have to change how we view production in college. And so they've made that change, and they've gone through and they've started drafting players as of 2022, drafting wide receivers that have a lot of productivity. And I think this is going to pay dividends for the Chiefs. I think both Skyy Moore and Rashee Rice are going to have good years next year and be contributors to his offense for years to come. So I like Brett Veach's wide receiver drafting better than I like John Dorsey's by quite a bit. Even though Dorsey was the man at the head of the round, or he was the GM during the Tyreek Hill pick, I still think that was a Brett Veach player that he wanted. So we'll never know the truth, but that's where I'm standing with that. I think Brett Veach was pretty responsible for Tyreek Hill. Moving on, I want to talk about the Chiefs wide receiver group and why it is such an interesting and intriguing group, and why I think that this is a team that could surprise some people with who produces for them in terms of receiving. Mahomes is incredible. He's going to put up numbers, even if I was back there catching the ball. Well, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about that, but I'm just saying Mahomes is really good, and I'm not. But another thing is that Andy Reid, through almost the vast majority of his coaching career, really had a wide receiver by committee type group. And he had really good offenses while doing this. So I have no concern whatsoever with Juju Smith-Schuster leaving. Last season, I had no concern at all with Tyreek Hill leaving. This is just what happens in the NFL. Players move on. They get new contracts elsewhere. Teams can't, make that investment. But however, this wide receiver group is interesting because I think that they need guys to step up, and they just have so many intriguing pieces. And we're going to start with Kadarius Toney. So Kadarius Toney, the Chiefs, from what we've heard, believe he is a legit wide receiver one. He has athleticism, particularly around his dexterity. I mean, he can juke, and he's so shifty, has good speed, can jump and get the ball. We saw what he could do last year. His main concern is injury. Can he make it through the whole season and stay healthy? And if he does, I think that, trying to put a wide receiver one label on him is not unfair. But, just have to see if he's healthy. His production in college, he wasn't the most productive wide receiver. I think he was in the bottom half of production. But I really like what I see, on the field whenever Toney's in the game. He has the ability to make guys miss. He's really difficult to guard. He can run pretty much any route. And so that's why he's interesting. Does he have potential to be wide receiver one? I will say yes. Worst case, he's a really good wide receiver too, I think, for the Chiefs next year. Moving on is the next piece the Chiefs added, and that's Richie James. And I think Richie James is the dark horse candidate for the Chiefs wide receiver group to have a really good breakout season. Why do I say this? I say this because he was first drafted by the 49ers and had a very mediocre rookie season. His second year, he built on top of that. He was traded to the Giants, and in his third year, he built on top of that. Then the Giants chose not to keep him around. And so he has had a trend throughout his NFL career where he has consistently, steadily had more and more production. And I think his first year he had around 150 receiving yards, second year around 250, and then last year I think he had about 550. And looking at my data, players who have consistent growth like that are not very common. And another reason why I think he's a good dark horse candidate to potentially be a breakout wide receiver for the Chiefs is because of his college production. So if I asked you who was, one of the most productive college wide receivers in the last 10 years, if I asked you that question, I would almost guarantee that you wouldn't say Richie James. But the truth is that Richie James was the 4th most productive wide receiver in college in the last 10 years based on his yards per game receiving. He was taken in the 7th round. So this is why, I think Richie James is a really intriguing prospect for the Chiefs. And I'm glad they picked him up. He's shown steady progress throughout the years. He had really good college production. And so maybe he's just one of those guys where the ball finds him. We'll see, but I'm hoping Richie James makes the team and continue to build on what he's done the past several seasons. Next player, Skyy Moore. So Skyy Moore, the most talented, let's say this. Skyy Moore is the most productive college wide receiver that the Chiefs have drafted in the last 10 years. So Richie James is the most productive college wide receiver on the Chiefs team. Skyy Moore is the most productive wide receiver in college that the Chiefs have drafted. He showed some promise last year and has really good hands. I think he's a good slot player, but he's another player for the Chiefs who, if next year ended up having the most receiving yards, I'd say, yeah, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised by that at all. And so just another intriguing option for the Chiefs. And what I'm trying to really get at here is that I think the Chiefs have 5 wide receivers who, if you told me, led the team in receiving yards or were second in the team in receiving yards to Travis Kelce, I would tell you, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. I could see that happening. Next is, my draft crush, Rashee Rice. Great athleticism, good production in college. And one other thing I want to say about Rashee Rice, actually 2 other things. I think that up to this point, an under-discussed part about his game is his intelligence and his football and instincts and his football IQ. 2 things come to mind whenever I talk about that. At SMU, there's a Hail Mary pass, and it was designed to be thrown to him. He knew that he was going to be triple covered. He knew that they were all going to try to stop him. The defense was going to try to stop him. So instead of trying to catch the ball and, pull a DeAndre Hopkins, catch the ball over, 3 defenders, he instead batted the ball to another teammate who caught the touchdown. And he did this by design. So that's a heads-up player, also an unselfish move on the field, So that takes a lot of, football IQ to even just think of doing something like that, thinking outside the box. And then Mahomes has raved about Rashee Rice. He said that Rashee Rice has come in and he feels like a veteran. He knows how to find the spots in the zone. He just knows where to be. And you can look that up online. Mahomes has said that about Rashee Rice. He says that he feels like this is not a college player coming in, not a rookie. This is a player with veteran experience because he knows where to be. He knows where I expect him to be. He finds the spots in the zone. And so I think that, another player on the Chiefs in the Chiefs wide receiver group who legitimately could have the most receiving yards for the Chiefs next year. So there's 5 guys who this person could be. And playing the numbers game, you have to think that, one of these guys is going to pan out and be a star in this league. And, I think Rashee Rice is just another one of those guys. Lastly, we have Justin Ross. And the reason I have Justin Ross on this list is because, one, I've seen his highlights from OTAs and, some training, and man, he just looks like the part, is in terms of his maneuverability, his route running, his acceleration, his, getting off the line of scrimmage. It looks different than the other players on the Chiefs team, and they've got some athletic guys. And nextly, Justin Ross had a really good breakout age. So breakout age, we've talked about it before on this channel, but it's essentially how young were you whenever you had your breakout in college? Were you 18 years old? Were you 19 years old? And Justin Ross was 18, 19 years old when he broke out on the college scene. And the reason breakout age is so important in terms of evaluating talent is because if you're that far ahead of your peers at 18, 19 years old, if you're that far ahead of your peers who are maybe 2-3 years older than you, when you get to the NFL and people are the same age as you, or you're in your prime, there's a good chance you're going to be that much better than your peers. So Justin Ross had a really young breakout age, then had a serious spinal condition discovered, also played with a foot injury. The Chiefs doctors have cleared him, but his production in college his freshman year was incredible. He was considered a first-round talent, and, obviously things didn't go that way for him. But this is another piece on the Chiefs roster who, if you told me they would lead the team in receiving yards for wide receivers on this roster, I wouldn't be surprised. So there's 5 guys that the Chiefs have. Not to mention, we're bringing back Marquez Valdes-Scantling. So the question I have for myself is, do I consider it 6 guys who could lead the Chiefs in receiving yards? And I'm going to say no. I'm sticking to 5 because I don't think MVS will lead the Chiefs in receiving yards next year. Now, watch me be wrong. Watch him go off for like 1,400 yards. That would be amazing. But I think at this point in time, Marquez Valdes-Scantling has been around in the NFL long enough that we kind of know what he does, what he's capable of. And he's a deep threat, who's good for a handful of catches a game. I don't think he's going to be a guy that's going to get, your 1,000-yard season, but you never know. I'm not including him in the 6, so I've got, 5 Chiefs receivers who I think could lead this team in receiving yards. Would not be surprised. And then Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who I think has a realistic shot of doing that, but I'm not going to, I don't think it's going to happen. But let me know in the comments whether you agree with that evaluation or not. Also, make sure that you subscribe if you've not done so already. We're trying to get to 30,000 subscribers. When we do, maybe we'll throw a little party. And then lastly, if you like this content here, make sure you like the video. I know you're going to like the next few videos that I'm going to put up. We're going to be going through and observing how the wide receivers have produced over the first 3 years of their career. We're going to see how college statistics translate into the NFL. We're going to see how draft round impacts statistics, in the NFL. And there's just tons of things we can do with this data. So I'm glad I'm done, getting the data ready. Now I get to play with it, and that's going to be a lot of fun. But that's all I got for today's video. Let me know in the comments what you think about these 5 receivers plus Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Which one could you see most likely being the Chiefs' leading wide receiver next year? If I was a betting man, which I sometimes am, I would put my money on Rashee Rice. That's just me. He's my draft crush. I'm allowed to have a crush. But I think that he's going to be a good pickup for the Chiefs. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. With that, I have nothing more to add. This is Gary signing out. It's been a longer than normal video, so thanks for being patient with me and sticking with me. Take it easy. Let's go, Chiefs.
Thanks for watching this video from the team at RGR Football. Click these videos to see more and subscribe to RGR Football.